Hi, I'm Dr. V.
And I'm Dr. A. Two docs on a mission to answer your burning questions about burning sensations and all things science.
This is What the Woo.
Mr. Ham and his followers have this remarkable view of a worldwide flood that somehow influenced everything that we observe in nature. A 500-foot wooden boat, 8 zookeepers for 14,000 individual animals, every land plant in the world underwater for a full year. I ask us all, is that really reasonable?
That's Bill Nye the Science Guy in his infamous debate with Ken Ham, the creationist founder of the Ark Encounter and Creation Museum. As Nye learned, it's nearly impossible to debate someone who uses faith and belief to contradict scientific evidence, since they can create nearly any narrative they want in order to refute the facts. We see this apply not only to evolution, but to medicine and climate science and all other sorts of woo. So, how does one live in a world of faith over facts? Can their minds be changed? Today, we talk to two people brought up as creationists in a fundamentalist church who have since renounced those beliefs and gone on to live in the world of mainstream science. What's it like being brought up in that environment? Can their evolution into evolutionists help us understand those who participate in other forms of science denial? That's today on What the Woo.
You know, you and I have had lots of discussions about the anti-science crowd.
Yeah.
That's
sort of our life right now.
Seriously. So we got to talking, and I was talking with a couple of my friends about all this shit and their upbringing, right? And thought, dude, this is a great podcast.
It is because I think there's sort of this misapprehension that people who have these beliefs are like bad, or there's something wrong with them, or they're not intelligent. And I mean, I don't believe that, and I don't think anybody does. And it's
I've had moments where I do. I'm not gonna lie.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard sometimes in the midst of the discussions not to get frustrated, especially when it's like our measles episode. However, I do think it's really important to sort of talk to people, especially when you're talking about that intersection of religion, because it plays such a fundamental role in your belief system growing up and kind of sets the stage for everything else. So I was really surprised when you told me that you had some friends who had sort of come around.
Fundamentalists, shall we say?
but we're no longer.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? And I feel like that's where, like, the fascination comes in, is like, how did you go from this background and make a 180? So
Yes.
I brought some friends in today.
I know, thank you guys so much.
And I mean,
what did you bribe them with?
Well, they did get to taste our wine from the barrel last night.
What?
I think it tasted like shit, but
Oh.
we can have that discussion on another podcast.
Okay.
And you know, maybe my friends have some different opinions, but so got two friends for us, and these are our first guest appearances on our podcast. So welcome. This is
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for coming, you know, making the big commute. So we have Jenna and Dave, two of my friends who both grew up in the same religious background, and have kind of survived it and gotten out of it. And now you can appreciate, like, that science is real and, you know, it has some good things.
Well, not only gotten out of it, Jenna, what do you do for a living now?
I teach biology for
Yeah.
the last 10 years.
Well, that's super interesting, right? And so tell me a little bit about your background.
So I grew up predominantly in Southern California, San Diego, and my mother brought me up in the church. So I got up every single Sunday and went to church with my mother. I went to the Sunday school while all of the grown-ups went to the big sanctuary. I got a religious indoctrination pretty much as I was being brought up, being surrounded by pretty much only people who also coincided with my mother's beliefs and the beliefs of the church. So it was pretty much a echo chamber, and all my friends were friends from the church. I didn't really have any friends from my high school. I would kind of keep to myself at school and be the shy nerd, and then I would go just let everything go with my friends as much as you can as good little Christian kids.
Were you in the public school system?
I was in a public school system. There were some friends that went to private school, but since my parents didn't pay for the private school education, they did their best, or my mother actually. My father was not religious, but my mother did the best she could to make sure that I only associated with people from my church by involving me in as many things church related as she possibly could. I went to church about 3 to 4 times a week.
That's
It
crazy.
was for college group or the regular service or practice for the band.
Well, and Dave is kind of, you know, he went to your same church, but he's a little bit different because your education was different, right? So can you tell me a little bit about your background and how it intersected with Jenna's?
I was kind of kept in a safety bubble most of my life. Was raised in the church. Both of my parents worked for the church. So my dad was a licensed minister, ran the sound for the church. And
Why aren't you running this?
I know, seriously, right?
I can help, kind of. So it was interesting. I mean, it was pretty much almost 24/7 involved in some aspects of being at the church. The first couple houses we lived in were owned by the church.
Oh, wow.
So we went from one house that was owned by the church to a separate one that was owned by the church.
Were you in the public school system?
No, I grew up in private school for kindergarten through 2nd grade, and then went to homeschooled for a couple of years up until I think it was the end of my fifth grade year.
And what was the homeschool, like, education basis? Like, was your mom teaching you because she has, you know, a master's in teaching?
No. No, and I think that's part of the ideology that kind of came behind the church upbringing and everything. It was this sense of that the devil had this influence on the education system, so it was like they needed to raise us either in private school or homeschool so they could really influence what we were taught and kind of direct that.
Your homeschool system was a religious-based homeschool education, right?
Yes, it was.
Like it was sold by the church, or how did they get that?
So I don't remember exactly what it was put on. It was some sort of organization, but everything was like religiously backed. So we had books that were, I think it was called Abeka books, that are all based in Christian theology. So while you're learning the basics of math, the science stuff was completely skewed. I don't
All your
remember.
word problems are based on religious concepts
Yes.
in math.
Yeah.
I have 3 Bibles, and Ted has 4 Bibles. You know,
Oh, wow.
And the religious stuff, I've seen some of these things as a biology teacher. I just have to laugh at the extent that they go to discredit the theory of evolution as much as they can, and that's basically their big focus. Is they do not like the theory of evolution, and they do not want their children learning about it. So
that's one thing I think we should probably clarify. We're not talking about just like conservative Christian backing. This was young Earth creation. Mm-hmm. The world is only 10,000 years old. So yes, they are not going to say, they're not progressive. They're not going to say, hey, let's accept the ideology of evolution or anything beyond that. It was just, this is wrong. It doesn't fit with our theology. So therefore it's from the devil, and we're not going to teach it to you.
So were they worried that if evolution was approached as a legitimate thought process and scientifically backed process, that therefore God couldn't exist?
I think that was their fear.
Yeah, I think it's just that it starts putting holes into the theology, because from what I know of it, the reasons why it doesn't fit is you've got the concept of Adam and Eve having original sin, right? And they are the ones that it comes from. So there was 2 people at one time that only lived on this earth, and we know that doesn't fit with the theory of evolution, right? Mm-hmm. You couldn't have just 2 people at one point. Right. So if that's the case, then Adam and Eve couldn't have existed. There could never be original sin, and then it goes into the ideology of, what did Jesus come to die for if there was never original sin? So it kind of makes things all fall apart, right?
Yeah, I don't think I ever got that before.
No, and it's interesting because I was brought up Catholic, but like really sort of cafeteria Catholic. Like I went once a week and tried to skip out on CCD, but I went to a Catholic university, and they sort of did toe that line, and they're like, look, like we know about this whole like God created the earth in 7 days, and we choose to look at it as a metaphor. So so it's interesting. It's such a different approach to have that sort of hard line. So I know for you, you were brought up on this, and it sort of permeated every aspect of your life. But for you, Jenna, you were in public school, and so I know you said that your social circle were mostly your friends from church. Do you feel like that was intentional? Like, did you feel sort of isolated because you had such different views, or was it like you were much more comfortable?
I think part of the reason I had the friends at church wasn't just because like my mother was dictating who I couldn't talk to and who I could, but it was that feeling that my views are basically not just different from other kids that I went to school with, but they were like the extreme. And I don't even know to this day whether I actually believed it wholeheartedly, but I knew that I had to, kind of thing. So I was afraid. I remember being afraid to tell people that I was a Christian because I wanted to be friends with the cool kids and everything, and I didn't want that stigma, kind of.
You know, it's funny you say that, because it's making me think of like a correlation to conspiracy theory, where you're like, you feel like you have the ultimate truth, but you're going to come off as nutty if you start sharing it, but you still believe it.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's hard when you're a kid and you're trying to find your place in the world, and you're trying to make friends, and you don't know who you are, what you want to be yet, or what kind of personality you're going to put forth, and, you know, that kind of stuff. And it just compounds it when you have, you know, I mean, to speak about it now, these kind of crazy off the wall kind of beliefs that you kind of, like you said, want to keep it to yourself because it just sounds batty. It just sounds like, no, I don't believe in that. I believe that, you know, the first man was made out of dust of the earth, and then the woman is a rib from the man, and, you know, all of this stuff, literally.
Yeah.
That's kind of, and then you take science classes, and then you feel persecuted because your science teacher is telling you you're wrong about something, and not like they ever get up there and say, that's a stupid idea, which is kind of what's perpetuated by, you know, Christians now, the persecution kind of feeling that their my science teacher told me I was a loser and I was stupid for believing in. I'm like, I've never been in a class that I've ever heard that happen. College professors telling people in Christian movies that are atheists, telling them, you know, you have to tell me that there's no such thing as God, or I'm going to fail you, kind of thing, you know, like stuff that doesn't happen. But
well, what I've seen that's always sort of interesting is you really have to, whenever you're talking about either conspiracy theories or even just sort of extreme ideological beliefs, in order for it to work, you have to sort of convince people that the other side is bad and not to be trusted, and that they have ulterior motives. And so I think that there probably is this fear, like if you actually are exposed to those people and you get to know that they're not evil and hate you, then that's like the first wedge, right? Like, well, if they were wrong about that, like, what else might they be wrong about? And it's interesting to me that you teach biology, like you light up as soon as you talk about that. So I'm getting a feeling that may be like the seed of what changed for you. Like all that whole thing about being exposed to public school and like messing you up is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
So what was the first inkling for you that like all of these beliefs that I have held so strongly, and I like not just the things I believe, but they're part of my identity, that I might not actually believe that?
I think it actually was my AP biology class I took as a senior in my public high school. It's the first time I was really introduced to the science in an unadulterated way, where it wasn't a Christian person or my church or whatever giving me the straw man version of what evolution was, and then beating it with a stick. You know, it was just straight up, these are the facts, here's the evidence that supports these facts. And it wasn't just about the theory of evolution. There were some other things too that I had, you know, previously been unfamiliar with, and been told erroneously by other people what it was. But it was kind of like, you know, this just makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I'm seeing these, you know, this evidence, And it's all like lining up with the theory that is presented to me by science and not by the creation theory that I've been told. Sorry, it's not a theory. The ideology of creationism, that doesn't line up with what I'm seeing, the evidence. So basically that was my first introduction to critical thinking.
Yeah. Both you and Dave have kind of mentioned in sidebar conversations about how your church coached you, like that, somehow, evolution may be presented to you, and then they gave you some guidance about that. Can either of you tell me about that?
I mean, I kind of think it goes back to, like I said, they were basically saying how the devil influenced all of this education so that, because he's the god of lies, it was to divert people from the truth. And so it was trying to stay away from that. It was we've got to have the small safety bubble kind of to live within, to kind of have, like, that's the only way to live by the truth, really.
Oh, and the devil buried the bones of the dinosaurs in the earth to trick us.
Oh, that's interesting. So it was more of just a fear-based, like, people are going to give you scientific information that may lead you to believe that evolution is legitimate, but just know that those scientific pieces were given by the devil.
Pretty much.
Okay.
They're being misled. Yeah.
So you sort of had that first tickle in the back of your head, like, oh God. There's some BS I've been spilling. What about for you, Dave?
So I mean, I think there was a couple things that kind of set me down that path. Part of it was being somewhat critical to a degree, not much, but I think in my high school years where I started really thinking about some of the theology and things that didn't make sense. I think it was kind of the first little creating the chink in the armor, if you will. And then I have to say, after meeting my wife for the first time, when we first started dating, she was very well educated and started coming at me with hey, evolution is not just a quote unquote theory. It's not just a hypothesis. It was like, this is, obvious fact. And, saying the Bible's kind of got some nice stories in it, but there's a lot that's not true. And it was something that I respected her and made me think more than just, thinking, oh, well, that was something she said, and
she's the devil.
Yeah, it wasn't like I was going to demonize her. I was just like, oh, okay, well, she thinks this way. Let me think about this a little bit more. And so it really got me thinking, and I think that set me down more of a path of, hey, maybe what I was taught wasn't real.
But it's interesting to me because it seems like in your church, the folks that were peddling these thought processes were also presented to you as educated folks. So why was it that those educated folks that were telling you that evolution is not real and is not legitimate, were suddenly less, like their thought processes from your childhood were less legitimate than, the educated person that became your wife? Like, why suddenly was it like your potential wife's education that was now better than the pastor at your church?
I don't necessarily know I would say it was better. It's something where, because it took a while for me to even let that go. It wasn't like as soon as, she says something, then it's like click, and my whole ideology changes and my whole focus changes.
That would make marriage so much easier.
Yeah, right.
They're right.
Truth's always
spouse
right.
Is right about everything.
So no, it was just the first thing of getting me to think, hey, maybe there's a different approach to this, maybe there's a different thought process behind this, and maybe there's more behind it than I ever thought about before. And so that's what got me thinking. It wasn't just let go of everything. And again, it took probably a couple of years after that point to where I was like, oh, this is actually fact. It's not just this thing that I didn't want to believe in, and that's just out there lies peddled by the devil.
I think too that for most people the deconversion process takes a while. It takes several years, because I didn't walk into AP class and get my first lesson of evolution, and then bam, I'm an atheist.
Yes.
You know, it's just started a process of self-growth. And over the, period that I was in college, I was taking, comparative literature, and it was comparative religion classes, and looking at different cultures and why people come to their beliefs, and just kind of getting my evil liberal college education kind of sort of led me down the path to thinking more for myself. Mm-hmm. And then I would go and I would research things on my own. I just became like a voracious reader of anything I could get my hands on that was not what I had been brought up, so I could get the opposite opinion about everything I thought, became super skeptical, and realized the best way to live my life is to base my beliefs on evidence, and to always question, especially if something goes along with my pre-existing beliefs, so that I can eliminate as much, confirmation bias kind of situations as I could.
Were you angry at all about the fact that you had spent so much of your life being brought up in things that you now no longer agree with? Does it bother you?
Right in the beginning, right as I was starting to really do that 180, I did have some resentment towards the things I missed out on when I was younger, and just more anger at myself, I think, than my family, because my mom did the best she could with what she thought she was doing, what she thought was the best for me. So I can't blame her for that. I do blame myself sometimes. I'm like, why did I not just think about that a little more? Why did I was I so accepting and so trusting
because you're
of these
taught
people?
That
and I was
faith
a kid,
trumps critical thinking,
right?
And I think that permeates so much,
and that you're evil for
These
thinking
things.
independently.
Yeah, like you have to quash that, right? Like that's because if somebody specifically says the second that you have that doubt, like that's just the devil.
Right, there's definitely the religion has some built-in safety mechanisms to prevent people from being able to think for themselves.
Yeah.
It's kind of, what a coincidence that anytime you think something different from what the church tells you, they have an answer for that, you're being deceived by the enemy, so you need to... I would ask questions in church, and that's the answer that I would get. Instead of an answer to my question, I would say, now, why do you think you're wondering that right now? Maybe it's the devil getting inside your head,
Man. Do you think that once you guys both started questioning your upbringing and, accepting science more, did that really affect your relationships with, family, friends, your church, if you were still involved at all?
I mean, for me, I don't think I really was very open about it. I wasn't going to I stopped going to church when I was 18. So that really, when I started kind of making that transition, I think it was mid to late 20s. So it wasn't a drastic impact on friends, family. And I don't think I've ever been one that's been super outspoken to call people out on anything. So I'm not trying to be, aggressive and telling people they're wrong. So I like to get along with people. I'm pretty laid back. So it didn't impact much. To kind of speak to your previous question, I was a little bit resentful towards family at the time, to kind of process everything, thinking, I mean, I don't know how much time I wasted, is what I feel like at this point.
Yeah.
I felt actually very isolated now when I was a kid, and I feel like I could have had better social skills, probably more quality
heathen
time.
Friends.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but even being able to connect with people, I still feel to this day it's kind of shaped me as a person, and not necessarily for the better, where I may not be as social as I want to be, or be able to be as social as I want to be, because of some of the patterns that were kind of instilled in me. And it kind of sucks, because I'm I was forced to live everything in the bubble of the church, basically. And that was it. I always had to have a plan, because it was something could go wrong, and you might get influenced by the devil to do something, and that was always there.
So I know that we've focused on evolution, but were there other, did they have sort of the views about vaccines that we see with some of the other fundamentalist communities?
This was pre the Andrew Wakefield era.
Yeah.
I think I graduated high school the same year that paper was published, so it wasn't part of the mainstream, conversation at the time. I don't know anyone who was anti-vax.
I don't know.
I don't think it was an issue for that. But I don't talk to them anymore, so who knows what bandwagon they've jumped on since then. I know there are a lot of conservative Christians who are anti-vaccination because, God will heal. And you're not trusting,
That's what I was gonna
God
say.
to heal the kids.
So like in each generation has to have this one flagship issue
Right.
that they choose to plant their flag on, like this one evidence-based issue that as a matter of faith. I mean, because it doesn't really hurt anyone to deny evolution, even though it makes your brain, crinkle as a scientist, but that those beliefs, the anti-vax...
Like, no one's going to die because they think
Right.
evolution isn't real.
Yeah, but the vaccine stuff...
Well, I mean, those beliefs encourage that, right? Like you're ultimately taught, and we were, that faith was the most important, and it was just like you'd have these altar calls of like, hey, people, go to the front, get prayed for. You've got these illnesses, go get anointed by oil, and God will heal you, and whatever healing meant at the time. But that was part of the ideology, and I know not everyone took it to the extreme of, well, now I don't need to go see my doctor. But I think that gave a bit of credence in what we were raised in to maybe advocate for that to a degree.
I think it goes together with the evolution too, because it's just an overall distrust of authority that's not of the church and science in general. Because people are distrustful of science based on the theory, then they're more likely to distrust science when it tells you other things that are directly applicable and important in their lives for their health and safety and those kinds of things.
You guys have mentioned to me in the past about how your church and the group that it comes from, the Assemblies of God Churches, had this whole speaking in tongues thing. Did that play into the whole science and?
Or just wait, back up. I want to hear about that.
Sorry, I just dropped that
In
mic,
Catholic
right?
Church, the only tongues we had was Latin.
Right, yeah.
And they were not enthusiastic about it.
Yeah,
Oh,
this
boy.
is different.
So, yeah. So, did they do that at your church then?
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Right
Tell
on,
me
right.
what that looks like.
I want to, set the scene.
I mean, you probably pull a YouTube video and easily find it's just
Oh my gosh.
babbling. I mean, and so
Is there any context, or people just, randomly start...
In the middle of a sermon?
Yeah.
It would freak you out because you right in the middle of a sermon, someone could be talking about something totally mundane and innocuous, like nothing like hallelujah, and then someone starts they would just be saying, and so in this Bible verse, and I don't know, they all had their different versions of the talking in the tongues, and that was probably a really bad impression. But
I don't think it's that far off.
but so then you'd have the person talk in tongues, and then there was the pressure that somebody had to stand up and interpret whatever they said.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it takes it to a whole new level, right?
Yeah.
Not
Yep.
only do you get to speak in gibberish, you don't have to plan your sermon, right? You can just be like, oh, I don't know what the fuck to say.
well,
let me go in tongues.
so-
and then
Find
someone,
servants.
one of your parishioners, nah, I got you, dude. And then he's like, oh,
It would be
Pastor
like-
so-and-so was saying.
What if he said evolution is real?
I know. Bet you that
Never
happened.
happened.
Never happened.
Interestingly enough, that didn't happen.
So I went to college with a girl, and she sounds a lot like you. She was brought up in a fundamentalist church, and then she ended up majoring in biology. And she told me that she spoke in tongues, but there was just sort of this social pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was a mark of you were touched by God if He put that words in her mouth. And so every once in a while, she'd just go up to the front, and she's like, I just close my eyes and put my hands up and just start saying humna humna humna, and then would clap, and it was like this.
Right.
I mean, it's
It's a
really
total
interesting.
attention grab. I mean,
Yeah. Did she? So when you were talking to her, did she own the fact that she was making that shit up?
Yes.
Okay. Because that's the thing that I was talking with them about before, is that, this seems very attention-seeking behavior, clearly. And also this whole, if I speak in tongues, then I now have gotten, to be special, right? Because God has chosen me to do the weird speaking in tongues thing. You're not a freak. You are anointed by God.
But that's the thing, right? Because I kind of almost think, you can talk yourself into believing anything about your quote-unquote inner voices, right? Like, sure, she was making it up, but maybe she could have convinced herself at the time, like, no, this is coming
I'm
from...
feeling it.
Yeah, because it's kind of like, I don't know, like my mother died 3 years ago, and I'm not necessarily, like, I don't really know what I believe, but I'll see a butterfly and I'll be like, oh my God, it's Mom, and you can convince yourself of things. And so I can see that it's like, I mean, I'm sure that some of the people out there really believed.
I think there's like 3 main kind of branches from things like that, and I'm going to tell you the story of me doing something like that in a second. But there's the people who truly believe they have the gift, and they feel that they are definitely being compelled by God to do these things. There's the people who know they're full of shit and are doing it for attention. And then there's the people who are getting so much social pressure that they should do it because if they don't, then they're a bad Christian or whatever, what have you. So I think there's also that third category of people who feel like they're a bad Christian or they don't have these gifts and there's something wrong with them if they don't do it, and maybe it's kind of in like, motor synchristic kind of response to what they think they should be doing. And one time we've gone on a missions trip and to Mexico, and I remember there being I was basically given a suggestion psychologically before we went down there. So this is what we do in Mexico. When you go to Mexico and Mexican people who are religious, they are quote unquote slain in the spirit. When they feel the presence of the Holy Spirit, they will collapse and fall to the ground, go unconscious, cry, eventually maybe fall asleep. So we were taught this as a group before we ever went down there. So partly so we wouldn't be freaked out about it because it wasn't something we did.
Only in Mexico?
It's not only in Mexico, but at the time we were told specifically where we were going.
Okay.
This is their culture. This is what they do.
Okay.
So what happens is we go down there, like one of the nights we're having like this big, kind of event where there's praying and there's preaching and there's testimonies and there's music and singing and all of this. And so gradually people around me from my church, not of that culture and background, start falling over and crying and doing these things you've maybe seen on YouTube or whatever. Yeah. And so I look around and I'm like one of the few people standing up still.
Oh, man.
And so I'm like,
now you're the pariah.
Why am I not the one? Why am I still standing up? I don't feel the need to. My knees didn't buckle on their own. I don't feel like this is weird. And so full on faked it because I didn't want to be the only one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
that kind of psychology, especially when you're a kid and you're impressionable, that has an effect on your behaviors. And, not only, the bad thing is not only was I deluding myself, but it's this self-reinforcing groupthink that allows other people to then go ahead and say, oh, see, everyone else, we all had this experience, so it was real. Mm-hmm. And so you had the experience, and none of us know that we're not the only ones faking. Everyone's faking, but we don't want to tell anybody, so we all think we're the only ones that faked it. Oh, yeah, it must be real.
Was there anybody standing at the end?
I don't recall, to be honest. Probably a couple people that weren't as impressionable as me. I don't know. Were you there that time?
I don't
know.
No.
Okay, so, yeah.
I mean, when you tell me this thought process, it really brings me back to, like, the Salem witch trials,
right.
And then it gets me thinking, because I believe your church had a similar Salem witch trial. Do we want to talk about that?
Yeah. Why don't we take a break?
Okay.
And then we'll come back, because this is fascinating. I did not realize you guys were part of this until Summer told me.
Dale Akiki, a man who, as a volunteer in their same church in the early 1990s, was caught up in satanic panic and accused of a horrific number of child abuse instances, including elephant and giraffe sacrifices while the parents were attending church upstairs. After a 9-month trial and 30 months of imprisonment, Akiki was cleared of every charge. That's part 2 of our interview, coming up next time on What the Woo.
Don't forget to subscribe to our WooCast on iTunes, Google Play, or directly on our website at whatthewoopodcast.com. You can email us at contact@whatthewoopodcast.com or go to our website and fill out the contact form there. We'd love to hear from you.
What the Woo is an educational podcast and is not a substitute for professional care and advice. Please seek appropriate medical care for any healthcare concerns. Opinions expressed are solely those of the doctors and not those of any sponsors or employers. Thanks for listening. See you next time on What the Woo.